All right, here we are, Exodus for beginners. This is lesson number 1. We're starting a brand new series on Exodus. And of course, as usual with our series, we begin with the first lesson, introduction, and the subheading of the introduction is called the golden thread. And I'll explain that idea to you in a moment. One of the resource books that I used for this study, Commentary on Exodus by D.A. Garrett. Mr. Garrett summarizes perfectly the difference between the books of Genesis and the book of Exodus, but also the essential purpose of the book we are about to study, which is the book of Exodus. Here's the passage in question, and I quote it. Exodus is the true beginning of the story of Israel. Genesis is essential to the story, but it is a prologue describing the lives of individual patriarchs rather than the history of a people. With Exodus, we begin the story of the national entity called Israel. In other words, in Genesis, the scene is set for the story that the Bible has been written to tell. And that story, of course, how and by whom the natural world came into being. The details explain mankind's creation and purpose, fall into sin, and of course the consequences of his sinful state. Genesis also records God's promise of an eventual Savior and his selection of one man, Abram, who later became Abraham, through which he would send his Savior. And of course, the book of Genesis finishes by focusing on the growth of this one man's family into a clan of 12 families, each led by the descendants of this one man, Abraham, who was originally chosen by God. Now, the book of Genesis covers a period of approximately 2,200 years between creation and the arrival of Jacob and his sons in the land of Egypt to join Joseph, his lost son, who had become second in command to Pharaoh. And we know that story well from Genesis. Now, during this period, the world began to be populated not once, but twice on account of the great flood in Noah's day. Again, all of this information is in Genesis. Nations were formed, cities were built, wars were fought, inventions, innovations, and languages were developed, creating a rich history of people and events studied today by archaeologists and historians. The Bible, however, is only interested in these histories insofar as they intersect from time to time with the history and the progress of this one family began by Abraham, the man specifically chosen by God for a special purpose. It's as if the history of the world is this gray backdrop in the Bible, and the story of Abraham and his descendants is a bright golden thread that stretches from Genesis all the way through Revelation. And no matter what is happening in the world, great or small, that golden thread is visible from its beginning with Abraham all the way through every chapter of history until it finds its natural completion and endpoint in Jesus Christ. And so we see its beginning in Genesis, as I've mentioned, with the formation of the 12 families who through various circumstances will find themselves sojourning, meaning living temporarily in Egypt because of a terrible famine in the place where they lived in the land of Canaan. Now in Exodus, we will follow that golden thread as we see that clan of families transformed into a nation and observe as that nation comes to know the true God, the I Am, the Jehovah God, who will now be their only God. We will observe His power to break Egypt with plagues. In the book of Exodus is contained the giving of the formal law and observances that the nation will be bound to and will inform every part of their lives. And it is in this book, the book of Exodus, that the sacrificial system, worship, the priesthood, and the place of worship are all explained and physically given. In other words, everything that makes these people distinct and separate as the people of God is introduced, initiated, and explained in the book of Exodus. And I say that, I begin with that simply to emphasize the importance of the book of Exodus. Without the book of Exodus, we wouldn't know who the Jewish people are, where they come from, how they got to be who they are, and why they do what they did. So a very important book. So we begin the introduction of Exodus in our normal way. We start with a critical introduction, and so we start with authorship and date. The book of Exodus is part of the Pentateuch, which is the term used for the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are the first 5 books in the Old Testament, what we refer to as the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is made up of 2 Greek words, penta, meaning 5, and tukos, meaning scroll. And so the Jews refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible, and the first 5 books as the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, or the books of the law. Moses has traditionally been considered the author of this book, even though the book itself does not mention its authors. However, the author was intimately familiar with the events that took place in the book. I mean, if you read the book of Exodus, the person who wrote it is an eyewitness of the events taking place, actually participates in the action itself. The author had access to information that only Moses could have known. For example, the interactions that he had with God, and wrote about these. And also the author was present and a witness to the miraculous events, the good ones and the bad ones, that took place at that time. Conservative scholars name Moses as the one who compiled and recorded oral traditions, genealogies, and personal eyewitness accounts into one orderly record of the Jewish people's departure from Egypt, their wanderings in the wilderness, and interactions with God. Jesus Himself attests to this in the New Testament. In John, for example, John chapter 5, verses 46 and 7, He says, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." So Jesus attests to the fact that Moses is the one who wrote the Pentateuch and was writing in a prophetic way about his own coming. He continues to say, "But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" John 5, 46 and 7. Then in John 7, 19, he says, "Did not Moses give you the law? And yet none of you carries out the law? Why do you seek to kill me?" So when he says, when Moses gave you the law, well, we'll read eventually in Exodus how God gave the law to Moses, and Moses gave the law to the people, and all the observances that God gave to Moses, Moses passed on to the people. So we have Jesus Himself, a witness to the fact that Moses is the one who wrote the law. Now, as far as time is concerned, Moses wrote this book somewhere between 1445 and 1400 BC. This is the traditional date that allows for Moses' life in context of biblical history, and it also aligns with the dates of other characters in the Old Testament, as well as various events. Some modern critical scholars deny that Moses wrote this book and that it was written during the Jewish exile in Babylon in the 6th century BC and completed after the Jews were freed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the walls and so on and so forth. This particular theory, however, does not explain why Jesus himself attributes the writing of the law or the Torah to Moses, as we have read in John chapter 5, 46 and 47. So if you're to take this other position that Moses didn't write it, it was written later on, then you also have to deny what Jesus said about Moses writing the first 5 books of the law. It's like a domino effect. If you deny the first thing, it bumps into other proofs that appear in the Bible and eventually destroys your theory. Of course, a lot of the action takes place in Egypt, and so I think it would help us to understand a little bit about the country of Egypt at that time. The word Egypt referred to the original name of the city of Memphis. I'm not talking about Memphis, Tennessee now, I'm talking about Memphis in Egypt. The original name of the city of Memphis was Mansion of the Spirit of Tam. And so the name Egypt comes from the root of that. A little bit about the geography of Egypt. It is a country in North Africa, an ancient country in North Africa. The Nile River made human habitation in Egypt possible. The river itself flowed from its source in the south, in Lake Victoria, which is situated in modern-day Uganda and Tanzania, and it flowed northward to eventually empty into the Mediterranean Sea. There is a debate whether the Nile in Egypt or the Amazon River in South America is the longest. They go back and forth, but when we're talking about the longest river in the world, we're talking about like 40 miles or something like that, a difference. So an amazingly long river. With its annual floods, the Nile not only provided drinking water, but it also cast up fertile soil on its banks to provide fertile ground for the planting of crops. This fertile strip adjacent to the river was called the Black Land, and the desert beyond it was called the Red Land. The Nile River Valley was Egypt, since everything else was wasteland and not habitable. When I talk about the valley, I'm talking about the river and the several miles of fertile soil along the river. A large part of the ancient kingdom south of the rich delta region, which was in the north, you see this in the map there near the Mediterranean Sea. So a large part of the ancient kingdom that was south of the delta was hundreds of miles long, but as I mentioned, only about 5 miles wide, because this is the only place where people could live. The main cities, the farming, the wealth, the population were located in the northern delta region called Lower Egypt, and the southern strip was called Upper Egypt. Since the Nile River flowed from south to north, the southern region was called upriver. And so you have the various cities that you note on this map here. Memphis was the capital city during the Old Kingdom period, and we'll talk about the various periods in ancient Egypt. Thebes was the capital during the New Kingdom, and we talk about the land of Goshen, that Jacob and his family lived in. The land of Goshen, well, the land of Goshen is up in the northern, the northeast part there in the delta. Egypt's geography largely protected it from enemy attack. For example, to the east was a harsh desert and of course the Red Sea. To the west was the vast Sahara Desert. To the north was the great Mediterranean Sea, and then to the south were natural waterfalls in the Nile itself, which made naval attack very difficult. The greatest weakness, geographically if you wish, was the overland route in the northern corridor, which connected the Delta region in the north there, the green part that you see, connected that with the land of the Canaanites, and later on the land of the Israelites. So you had this northern route that got you into this particular territory. The greatest strength of the country was the abundance of food that they grew in the delta and the valley to provide for their nation and export to other countries. Now, they also had an abundance of gold and precious stones, which showed up in the beautiful artworks that they produced that are available and to be seen in various museums even to this day. They also were great producers of food, and that's behind the story of Joseph when he is in Egypt. A little bit about the history. Egypt was ruled by pharaohs that lasted 3,000 years. It was the first world power. Its history can be divided into 11 major eras, and in briefly reviewing these, we can also begin to see where Egypt's connection to the Jewish people appear historically. So let's take a look at the chronology of ancient Egypt. Scholars put the date of the Exodus at around 1447. So let me just show you a little bit of the history here before we position when Joseph entered Egypt, when the Jews were there. So you have the pre-dynastic era prior to 3000 BC. That shows you how old a country this is. Egypt was not unified at that time. The Archaic era, between 3000 and 2700 BC, Egypt was unified. Classical Egyptian culture was established at this time. You have the Old Kingdom period, the 3rd to the 8th dynasty, 2700 to 2160 BC. This is the Pyramid Age, when the pyramids were built, and Egypt was powerful and united. You have the First Intermediate era, 9th and 10th dynasties, 2100 to 2000. During this time there was chaos, disunited Egypt. And then we enter the Middle Kingdom. This is the 11th and 12th dynasties, 2100 to about 1786 BC. A second era of power and unity which overlaps with the First Intermediate. Now, the important part of the Middle Kingdom is that this is the time we believe that Joseph Joseph was brought to Egypt, and we know the story how he rose to power, becoming second, if you wish, in command of the nation during the famine, and it was during the famine that his brothers came to find food, and eventually the family was reunited and brought to Egypt to live. A little more information here, more eras. The Second Intermediate era, 1700 to 1550, weakness and division. This period includes the Hyksos dynasties. And then we have the New Kingdom, the 18th to the 20th dynasty, 1550 to 1069. And this is important because Egypt's imperial age, the Exodus probably took place in the 18th or 19th dynasty. This is where the Exodus took place. So we can continue. Third Intermediate, the State Persian era, the Ptolemaic period, and then the Roman period after 30 BC there was a decline, and it was the end of classical Egyptian culture under Roman domination. So what we do know for sure are the events and the sequence as well as the characters involved, because God has preserved these as that golden thread that spans human history and reveals the story of how He eventually saved mankind from the consequences of sin. The point I'm making is you have this ancient nation, and it has so many eras and so many events taking place during the 3,000 year history of this nation. And what we have in the Bible is just that golden thread, two periods in their history. One where Joseph appears, and then several hundred years go by, and then where Moses appears to lead the people out of Egyptian bondage. That golden thread simply appears a few times in their history and then moves on. And their history continues, but the Bible doesn't record it. The Bible doesn't even refer to it anymore. So this is basically a summary of the history of Egypt, and at which point the Jewish people came in contact with that nation and with the kings of that nation. So let's move on to the summary, if you wish, and the purpose of the book of Exodus. Exodus is first and foremost a historical record that traces the period of time and events that take the descendants of Jacob and his family from Egypt, where they fled to for safety from the famine taking place in the land of Canaan, which was their home at the time. And then we go back through a long journey in the wilderness to the place where they came from 400 years earlier, but this time to re-enter their former dwellings as conquerors, receiving from God the land that was promised to their forefathers. In other words, if we keep our eye on that golden thread, we'll see Joseph being sold into slavery, and then a long period of time goes by, 4 centuries actually, and then Moses appears and rises up to be a leader among the Jews, and we see God's great miraculous powers working to free the Jewish people who have become slaves in Egypt and lead them out of Egypt and into the wilderness and eventually into the promised land, the land that they had escaped, the land that they had left because there was a famine 400 years before that. But if we follow the thread will simply take us from Joseph to Moses, and then back to the promised land. So Exodus is the history of that return journey and the transformation that God works as He literally creates a new and distinct nation out of a people with no leader, no purpose, and no power, having developed as a slave population while living in Egypt. The book of Exodus tells us this story. Exodus is more foundational as far as the Jewish religion is concerned, since it has more central places in Jewish history than the book of Genesis does. For example, according to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 20 to 25, when an Israelite child asked his parents why they were under so many religious rules and regulations, the answer was to be, "We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand." So for the people of Israel, their founding event was not the call of Abraham recorded in Genesis, but the events that are contained in the book of Exodus. Their history as a distinct people, the people of God, along with the religious practices that guided and confirmed their position as God's people, are all found in Exodus, not in the book of Genesis. So Exodus provides the explanation for the claim that the Jews were the people of God, the chosen people. You know, if someone says, how do you know that the Jews were the chosen people of God? Where does it say that? Well, you would take them to the book of Exodus and you would read and show them, you know, how these people who were not a people became a nation, became God's people. And the book of Exodus explains how that happens. All right, so we have some main characters in the book of Exodus. First of all, the Jewish people. As I say, Genesis provides the backstory of who the Jews were and how they came to be in Egypt. However, Exodus introduces them in the first 7 verses and simply adds that from a small beginning, they grew into a large and powerful population that actually threatened the native Egyptian population by their growing numbers and potential influence. They had no leaders, which are mentioned among them. No one spoke on their behalf as a group. They were still an association of clans led by family elders. Another main character, of course, is God himself. In Genesis, we see God's power in creating the universe and his dealings and appearances to individuals. In Exodus, we begin to see other aspects of his being. He is, for example, the one and universal God. In Exodus 3 verse 15, God refers to himself as the I am, and this sets him apart from every other God. He's also the God of wrath. From the plagues on Egypt to the thunder and lightning on Mount Sinai, God demonstrates his ability to punish and intimidate his enemies as well as his disobedient people. And he's also the God of mercy. Mercy is his primary characteristic and not wrath. And this is shown by his compassion in response to human suffering. You know, the Egyptians were enslaving the Jews and they were crying out to God. He endures patiently the repeated provocations of the Jews when they complained and they were ungrateful or they rebelled against him. And he forgave and restored them after their grave sin with the golden calf. He's also the God who is wholly other. He is completely holy and unlike man. Moses had to remove his sandals to enter the holy space of the burning bush, and God only interacted with the people through Moses, who became his sanctified servant. He was also the God of Israel. The Jews became a special people through divine intervention, a sign that God can interact with humans without destroying them. And he is the God of the moral law. The people of God are bound to his laws, which are holy and righteous and moral and very specific. And so the point here is that no other God revealed himself in such a personal and dynamic way as this God, as the God of the Jews. He was above man, not because man had placed him among the deities, which is what happened with the pagan gods of the Egyptians. The Egyptians are the ones that invented these gods and placed them, in the pantheon of their gods. The God of the Jews was above man by virtue of what he revealed about himself. Being above man was the natural place for him to be. And a third main character that we find in the book of Exodus is, Moses, of course. Moses, the man of God. Now the book of Exodus seeks to glorify God, but it also establishes Moses as the founder of the nation of Israel. Moses is a new Adam, a new Noah, a new Jacob. He is a man who is molded by God for greatness despite his personal flaws, despite his mistake. For example, he recklessly kills an Egyptian in trying to assert himself as a leader and a potential savior of his people early on in his life. And then he lives in self-imposed exile, underemployed as a shepherd in the wilderness. Then he refuses to speak as God's representative, so that God has to provide Aaron, his older brother, to carry out this task. And of course we see he flashes a bad temper, he has a quick temper, when he violently throws down and breaks the tablets upon which the commandments were written by God. Upon seeing the people worshiping the golden calf, he sees the people worshiping this idol, and he's so angry he throws the tablets that God himself had written on, he throws them on the ground and they break. So we see several times that his temper gets him into trouble. However, God patiently brings him to spiritual maturity, even greatness, because despite his failings, Moses never abandons his faithful service to God. Even after he is told he's not going to enter the promised land with the people because of his disobedience, and in many instances his disobedience caused by his temper. Anyways, because of his disobedience, this time in striking the rock twice instead of speaking to the rock in order to draw water, that story we read about in the book of Numbers, chapter 20, even though he is told by God he's not going to enter the promised land, he continues to faithfully serve God as best he can, following his instructions, helping to establish Joshua as the one who will continue his leadership role. So Moses is the great as well as relatable role model for weak and sinful people who sincerely aspire to please God and serve Him in important and dynamic ways. Good role model for that. And then a fourth main character is Egypt itself, the symbol of worldly power. Egypt represents every worldly power that God's people have had to deal with in every era. It is the antitype for every worldly kingdom in opposition to the kingdom of God, from the beginning to the final day of this ongoing conflict, to the end when Jesus comes to destroy it once and for all time. Worldly powers, worldly kingdoms who worship gods of wood and stone, worldly kingdoms who concentrate power in the hands of few, in this case in the hands of Pharaoh, worldly powers who oppress the righteous with slavery and murder and hatred and separation, worldly kingdoms and powers who have a fixation on material prosperity as a major factor in decision making, worldly kingdoms who are dependent on the power of the occult and the influence of dark power and legitimize this type of thing in their power. And worldly powers who represent and facilitate apostasy. You know, I've never seen a government that actually promotes the belief and obedience to Jesus Christ. They're usually the other way around. So Egypt, just as every world power since, except perhaps in certain ways and for certain times America, Egypt featured these symbols of worldly kingdoms which were all on display in their dealings with the Jewish people. They did all of the things that worldly kingdoms do to believers. And so Exodus reveals for the first time the features of the king of the heavenly kingdom, as well as his power and ability to subdue and to destroy even the mightiest of earthly kingdoms and earthly powers. And so from the beginning of the Bible with the Egyptians and throughout the Bible with the Assyrians or the Babylonians, all the way to the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, where God's kingdom eventually defeats the greatest of the earthly kingdoms, and that was Rome, the story is always the same. God's kingdom on earth today, the church, will never be defeated by an earthly kingdom and will continue this winning streak until Jesus returns to finish the struggle with His judgment and final removal of the heavens and the earth, along with all the earthly kingdoms, leaving only one kingdom to exist and rejoice with Him in eternity. And we get to see God working this plan as we follow, as I mentioned, that golden thread that begins in Genesis and works its way throughout history, through the various kingdoms and through the various wars and happenings and goings on of this world and the various nations. We follow that golden thread that will take us finally to the return of Jesus and the beginning of eternity. And so Exodus is the story of the formation of an early stage of this heavenly kingdom, if you wish, which is the nation of Israel, and the defeat of one of the first of these earthly kingdoms, which is Egypt. And that is for this morning, for this time, our lesson, our introductory lesson on the book of Exodus. Next time we get together, we're going to look at the outline of the book itself, give us an idea of what's going on, the various activities taking place in the book of Exodus. And
Forever lover. In the depths of the darkest night, your love shines through, a guiding light. With every heartbeat I feel your grace. In your warm embrace I find my place. Darling, don't cry, don't shed a tear, for I'll be your fortress, I'll always be near. Though storms may rage and oceans may roar, I'll stand by your side forevermore. Through the trials and the tests we face, our love will endure, it cannot be erased. So dry your eyes, my love, and take my hand, together we'll conquer.
I would encourage you to read ahead. In other words, this week, read chapters 1 to 10 in the book of Exodus, because in our method of study, I'm not going to, this is not a line-by-line study, okay, where we get to read every line. We don't have time to do that in the number of lessons. 13 lessons in this series. So we go from one section to another. And so I'm going to assume that you have read the material. I'm only going to read certain parts of things, and it'll be much more edifying for you if you read ahead. Also, I encourage you to make sure you have your notebooks, the workbooks, the student workbooks that you have, where you can take notes, and there's lots of information in that workbook that I don't necessarily refer to or don't have time to talk about here in class, but the workbook has the extra information that you'll need. And as everything with Bible Talk, you can download a free PDF copy of that on our website, bibletalk.tv. Or if you don't feel like doing all that, you just want to get the book, you can always order it. I don't know, it's $3 or $4 or something. And they'll send it to you in the mail, and you'll have a nice copy of it with a hardcover, but it'll be the same material that is contained inside. So I thank you for joining us for this first lesson in the series. I want to thank folks who are watching online, and in the same way encourage you to download the workbook. If you're going to follow along with this, you'll find it to be very helpful. So God bless you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.